Now what happened afterwards, what went on in Gaza this summer, I don't need to tell you about. There's plenty of people who were there, who documented it. Palestinian journalists and other international journalists on the ground can tell you about the horrors that they witnessed. But just the basic outline, you know, over 2,000 people killed, over half of them civilians. There were so many dead that they had to store bodies in fruit and vegetable coolers. Children's bodies they had to hold in ice cream freezers. And while this is going on, in Israeli society, the hatred is brewing. And so you go onto Facebook, and what do you see? You see Jewish Israelis changing their names on Facebook from Yosef Yehuda to Yosef Yehuda Mavet LaAravim. Yosef Yehuda, death to the Arabs. Ben Nuriel becomes Ben Nuriel, death to the Arabs. Then you go over to Twitter and you do a search for Aravim, the Hebrew word for Arabs, and you see people tweeting, "Stinking Arabs, may you die. Kill them already, Arabs are whores. From the bottom of my heart, I wish for Arabs to be torched. Arabs, may you be paralyzed and die with great suffering." And when I would click on these tweets to go to the profiles of these people to see who was saying these things, I was horrified to find out these weren't adults. These were young women, maybe 14, 15 years old, saying these things. This is how early it starts, and even earlier. Now, of course, there are Jewish Israelis who oppose the war. People who went out into the streets and expressed their indignation at what was going on. You had people protesting, like here, in front of the American embassy in Tel Aviv. You had Israelis protesting in front of army bases against the assault. You had people taking over street corners with signs, like here, again, I've translated it, "The occupation kills us all." But what did the government have to say about these anti-war protests? What messages did they give to the people while this is going on? So Tzipi Livni, who at the time is the justice minister or injustice minister in the Israeli government, she decides to go on vacation. I guess her services aren't needed. And while she's on vacation, she puts this on her Facebook. "I saw this horrible poster. It says Free Palestine. I managed to tear part of the poster." And then she uploads an image of herself, I guess, fiddling with it, trying to tear this Free Palestine poster. So the message is, this is the woman who's supposed to stand for law and order. And she tells the Israeli people, if you see a sign standing up for Palestine, you tear it up. You rip it down. And that's what happened. So yes, people did go out to protest the war. But this is what they faced when they got there. And so if you were a Palestinian citizen of Israel, the police just beat you up willy-nilly. Arrested over 1,000 people, held them for weeks and months even. And that's in Haifa. But in Tel Aviv, it was the protesters, mainly Jewish. There's a little bit more leeway because they have Jewish privilege, so the police aren't nearly as rough with them. But there, they don't have to do the job because there's gangs of thugs. Again, these are the Lehava street thugs, you can see by their emblems. And they went to counter-protest the anti-war protesters. And it wasn't just ripping up signs. It wasn't just beating them in the streets. You had these thugs actually following the anti-war protesters back to their homes. Quietly, carefully following them home and then attacking them in the lobbies of their own apartment buildings once they were separate and defenseless. And we can't expect that the police are going to provide any protection because they are at least as racist, if not more so. So you see this summer, Israeli police officers writing on their Facebook, "Your kids are terrorists like you. Die, every one of you stinking Arabs. Or this officer who wrote on his Facebook page, may another 1 million Arab children die. Amen. These are the people who are supposed to protect us. And in Haifa, it was even worse. You had people attacking the anti-war protesters being evacuated in ambulances, and thugs chasing after the ambulances, trying to beat them up even more. You had the deputy mayor of Haifa going to an anti-war protest and being set upon by a group of thugs. And he says the police were right there. They saw the whole thing. They witnessed it and they didn't do a thing. This is the deputy mayor. And this is the reality. This is Israel in 2015. That the public space is being decanted of Arabs, of Palestinians. Groups of thugs will walk around the streets of Jerusalem and they'll ask people, Slicha, ma sha'a? Do you know what time it is? And then as soon as I hear your response, and if you have even a shred of an Arabic accent, then I know you're Palestinian, and then my whole gang swarms you. And so we've come to the point where Palestinian people are hardly, if ever, going to downtown Jerusalem anymore. They realize, I'm not going to take the risk. I'm not going to get my head kicked in. And so these groups have set the tone and are slowly ethnically cleansing the city streets of non-Jews. Now, we saw the results of the carnage, how many people lost their lives, and everyone is much more than a number. Everyone has their own story. But while people are counting their fatalities, you have Israeli soldiers receiving awards for the damage they did. You have soldiers receiving mementos from their army units, photographs of neighborhoods in Gaza before and after, so you can relish in your accomplishments. And others who printed out t-shirts, deployed, destroyed, enjoyed, Gaza 2014. Surveys conducted at the end of the war consistently found that 95% of the Jewish Israeli population felt that the operation was justified. Only 3% said that they felt the army used excessive firepower. Now, let me just interrupt for a moment and say I actually believe this number is higher. The reason why is because we've come to the point where people are afraid to say what they really think and feel. If they are against the racism, if they oppose the war, they're afraid to say it. They don't want to lose their friends and family, and they don't want to lose their jobs. And that's a really legitimate fear. So I feel that maybe it could be up to 5% or even 10% or 12% perhaps, but it's definitely not 20 or 30 or 40 or 50. We're still talking about a tiny fraction of the population. No shocker, we've got ideologues of the ruling Likud party. There's no shame. There's no need to filter their words anymore. They just let it all out. So you have Hillel Weiss writing on his Facebook page during the war, listen up, Abu Mazen, that's Mahmoud Abbas, the president of the Palestinian Authority. You are not a people. Palestinians are not a people, so therefore it can't be genocide. Destroying you like the horde that you are is commanded by Yahweh, commanded by God, and it will take place sooner or later. Outright calling for genocide. No shame. Another appointee of the ruling Likud party. See, once this happened, I mean, it's a process of years, but in recent years, as I pointed out in the beginning, the level of corruption, I talked about how difficult it is to get to the end of the month because of financial constraints. A lot of Israeli youth are thinking, I can barely make a living, I can't save any money. This crazy racism going on in the streets. What's left for me? What's the point? And so more and more of them are opting out and actually moving to Europe, specifically to Berlin, if you can imagine this, the same place that their ancestors fled from a couple generations back. And today they see it as a beacon of democracy and multiculturalism and tolerance. And so you have this phenomenon now of Jewish Israeli youth moving to Berlin. Now, when at some point Israeli media notices this, realizes that it's a phenomenon and writes reports about it, and then it becomes a scandal. What? Jews moving to Germany? And so we have this official of the ruling Likud party writing on his Facebook, "Excrement of feces people. I doubt you are Jews. Shits, human garbage, pathetic, show your faces. Get the hell out of here. Don't come back, and don't come looking for us when the butcher's slaughtering knife returns." Well, I guess this is partly why we saw this summer at these anti-war protests, at least one protester holding up this sign, "Flee while it is still possible." Flee the butcher's slaughtering knife. Well, while some Jewish Israelis at least are leaving the country, there are other people for whom there is a literal butcher's slaughtering knife hanging over their heads. In recent years, between 2006 and 2012, you have 60,000 African refugees entering Israel. These are the people I spoke of earlier, mainly from Eritrea and Sudan, in East Africa. Now, by way of analogy, let me show you a few images to paint a picture. So these photographs of people walking onto a luxury liner, you see them boarding the boat, ships sailing, they're on deck taking photographs. They didn't call them selfies then, they just called them photographs. So you're taking photographs and smiling and laughing and chilling and posing with their families and with their friends and on their own, and you can see clearly they're having a time of it. This guy is roller skating on deck. You see a man holding a glass of wine, casually sipping. You see other women lying in lounge chairs. Dining halls look very attractive, first-class facilities. Now, all these images I'm showing you are of the SS St. Louis. Now, I don't know if you know about this ship, but a little history lesson. So on the very eve of World War II, when it was already clear what Hitler had in mind for European Jewry, it was still possible for at least some German Jews to escape. And so you have this boat leaving, disembarking from Hamburg, and carrying on it almost 1,000 Jewish people trying to escape the Holocaust to come. And they got to North America, they crossed the Atlantic, and no country would have them. This country rejected them outright. The United States refused to accept anyone. The Caribbean countries wouldn't have it. And so, because they wouldn't take any of these Jewish refugees, the boat was forced to turn back and return to Europe, and almost all the people on board ended up perishing in the concentration camps. Now, why am I telling you this story? Yes, this man is roller skating on board. Yes, these people are sipping wine and having a good time and posing, and they're wearing nice clothes, and they're embracing, and they're smiling. But there's not one person in this room who would claim that they're not refugees. They ran away from Nazi Germany, and they were forced to return to Nazi Germany, and they died in Nazi Germany. They're refugees in any sense of the word, and I can hardly imagine anyone claiming otherwise. And yet, these people are refugees, but Israel claims that these people aren't. According to the Israeli government, these people, stuck like sardines, trying to escape any way they can, dying by the thousands, drowning in the Mediterranean, running in every direction, filling up refugee camps all over the African continent and in Europe, Africa, in other parts of the African continent, and further on in Europe and North America and Australia. But according to Benjamin Netanyahu and the Israeli government, none of them are refugees. They are all just trying to make a quick buck. And that's why they've come to Israel. Yeah. Risking their lives, giving their lives to make a quick buck. Well, when these 60,000 African refugees came to Israel, walking through the Egyptian Sinai desert, it didn't look that different from the mythical story of the biblical exodus from Egypt. This is what the border between Egypt and Palestine looked like 100 years ago. It probably didn't look that different in 2006 when these African refugees began streaming over the border. This is, until a couple years ago, this is what the border looked like. Now, clearly, it wouldn't be fun to try to get over it. There's barbed wire, you get caught in it, but obviously not insurmountable. And that's how these people entered Israel, and none of them snuck in. Every single one of them abided by international law. They crossed the border, they didn't try to go any further, they waited there. They waited for the Israeli army patrols to come by. Army came, collected them, they went where they were told to. They had medical checkups to make sure they didn't have any communicable diseases. They went through security checks to make sure they didn't have police records and they weren't terrorists. And they were allowed to enter Israel. Now, that's ended because the government wanted to end this migration to prevent any more Africans from coming into the country, and so it spent billions of dollars to build this high-tech fence along the border. So now, that's it, no more African refugees coming into the country. But what about the 60,000 that are already there? The government ignores almost all of the applications, so 80% of their asylum requests are just outright ignored. And for those asylum requests that they do respond to, almost every single one is a rejection. So of those 60,000, Israel has granted refugee status to 4 Eritreans. 4. But I bet those 4 are the best damn refugees. I bet they really suffered. Yeah. Well, it's so bad that, if you can imagine this, the United States of America actually grants asylum to more Israelis every year than Israel grants to Africans. And it gets worse. So this is a law that was passed by the United States Congress a year ago. You guys, we have these omnibus bills here in Canada too, right? Where the government tries to pass this legislation. It's like 1 million pages long. It's got everything's in it. You're never going to read it, but they just cram it all through. So in the same way, Congress does the same thing, passes these massive bills. And a Twitter follower of mine alerted me to the fact that buried in one of these bills, deep, deep, deep inside, they found this paragraph that stated, $15 million shall be made available for refugees settling in Israel. And this is just last year. In the last decade, the US government has given hundreds of millions of dollars to Israel to resettle refugees. Wow, I mean, that's amazing. With all these 60,000 African refugees, here the United States is stepping up and helping them out, helping them, get on their feet, provide them with some sustenance so that they can rehabilitate their lives. Well, not so quick. Instead of giving that money to help these poor people, what the government has done, Netanyahu has simply transferred the funds to his friend and ally Natan Sharansky, the head of the Jewish Agency. That's a sectarian group that by mandate it only aids Jews and no one else. And so instead of this money actually being used to help legitimate refugees, these hundreds of millions of dollars are shunted aside and they go into Sharansky's pocket or into the budget of his organization, supposedly to help Jewish families who immigrate to Israel. So if it's not bad enough that they don't grant any refugee status, they take these hundreds of millions. And if they don't accept any African refugees, who do they accept? Well, these two men, top Ukrainian officials, just in the last few months. Now, the United States government, yes, it sends millions to Israel, but it also sends millions of dollars to the Ukraine. In recent years, it's contributed tens and hundreds of billions of dollars to the Ukraine in order to support democracy and democratic institutions in that country. These two Ukrainian officials absconded from the country with that money. They took those tens of and hundreds of billions of dollars and they fled to Israel, and within hours they were granted refuge in Israel. Now, Israel's relationship with Africa is, let's face it, a pretty sordid one. When we look at the Israeli economy, one of the pillars of the Israeli economy is the diamond industry, and that's very heavily based on exploited African labor. And one of the other top industries of the Israeli economy is the defense industry. Proportionately, Israel is actually the biggest defense manufacturer and distributor in the world, in proportion to its population GDP. And I'm sad to say it, but this photograph isn't from Auschwitz. These skulls and bones aren't in black and white, they're originally in color. This photograph wasn't taken in Europe, it was taken in Africa. These bodies, how many of them died because of Israeli weapons? During the genocide in Rwanda, while it was ongoing, Israeli arms manufacturers continued to sell arms and ammunition even to those militias who were perpetrating the genocide. And this went all the way up to the top. Top Israeli officials knew it was ongoing throughout, and they permitted it to continue with their blessing. Now, that's why this man, he's an Israeli professor, he's filed Freedom of Information requests because he demands that we get to the bottom of this and that we open up these files and we have a long look at what really went on and who is responsible. We need a Truth and Reconciliation Committee. And he brought it to the courts, but the government has stymied his efforts, and the judge has refused thus far to open up those files. And so at this point, we don't know the full extent of Israel's participation in that horrendous genocide. But thankfully, the courts do come to the help of people who need it on occasion. And in the case of African refugees, they've actually come out in their favor, not once, but twice. So the Israeli government, determined to round up these African refugees into detention centers and from there deport them back to Africa, passes a law authorizing itself to do so. It comes to the Supreme Court and they say no. These people have done nothing wrong. They've committed no crime. They do not deserve to be behind bars. You must release them immediately. Instead of abiding by the Supreme Court decision, the government just flipped the script and authorized a new version of the same law, this one even more draconian than the first version, and again, authorizing it to round up Africans. And once again, it comes to the Supreme Court, and again, they strike it down. It's the only law in Israeli history that the Supreme Court has struck down twice. You would think they would get the message, but no, the government is so determined to ethnically cleanse the country of non-white, non-Jews that it legislates a third version of the exact same law so that it can continue to round up Africans. And this is the state that we're in currently. So without any work permits, I mean, some Africans are working under the table, but they're easily exploitable by their employers. And for many, it means abject poverty without the ability to sustain themselves. And for others, it's just Israeli security services roaming through the city streets, rounding up Africans off the streets of Tel Aviv and other Israeli cities, and dragging them down to these desert detention centers. And of course, it's in the middle of the desert. It's on the border with Egypt. There's nothing to do, nowhere to go. They get these furloughs where they're allowed to, walk out into the desert, but they're far from any population center, and there's not much they can do with that. But you would think that at least the services there would be, somewhat, that they would at least provide minimal services for these people. But no, it's all part of the government's plan to make their lives miserable. That's a direct quote from the Interior Minister, to make their lives miserable. And that even translates into giving them piss-poor medical services. If you can imagine this high-tech marvel, Israel, who supposedly sends, missions all over the world and, nanotech and biotech, but they can't afford beds for these African refugees they've rounded into camps. And this winter, I know it's almost silly to bring this up to a Canadian audience, but it doesn't get nearly as cold there as it does here. But keep in mind, these buildings are insulated. In Israel and Palestine, the houses don't have that level of insulation. So when it gets cold, it gets really, really cold. You can't keep the cold out. And while the snow's coming down and we're going below zero, so the Israeli media runs a puff piece. It's so proud of itself. Aren't we a peace-loving people? Aren't we a loving people? We even installed heaters so the zebras in the zoos don't have to freeze to death. And yet, the government refused to allow heaters for those African refugees that it rounded into these camps. Only they could have one state-issued blanket per person. Even if some of their friends wanted to donate a heater, they wouldn't allow them in. Disgusting. Now, where is Israeli society in all this? Where is the media? Why isn't anyone raising an alarm? Well, human rights groups are doing their best to at least speak about it, to call out the problem. And so you have Human Rights Watch preparing a very detailed report on how the Israeli government is persecuting African asylum seekers. And it invites all the Israeli media outlets to hear this report. And it calls a conference, and not one reporter shows up. So you have a couple African brothers who came to hear what would happen. So he's just like, okay, well, you might as well come up to the front because there's no audience behind you. The seats are completely empty. So just come sit close to me and I'll tell you what my findings are. There was no one who came to hear the report. Now, how did we get to this point that no one cares? That people are rounded into camps and no one cares? Well, there are NGOs who are trying to speak to the Israeli population and convince them to, change the image of African people in their minds, to try to get them to empathize with these African refugees. So they conducted a poster campaign where they paid for these banners to go up around Israel, where they would take photographs of Israelis and Africans together and write Lo Zarim, Chaverim, not foreigners, friends, to try to change people's conceptions of how Africans could easily be integrated into society. They could be partners. They could contribute. But while there are NGOs doing their darndest to try to push in a positive direction, on the other hand, you have top government officials who are doing the opposite, doing everything they can to demonize and to dehumanize these Africans. So you have Miri Regev, the top female official in the ruling Likud party, and she tells a crowd of thousands of Israelis, an anti-African rally in downtown Tel Aviv, she tells them the Sudanese are a cancer in our body. Now, admittedly, she later apologized for her comments. But she didn't apologize to Africans for comparing them to cancer. She apologized to Israeli cancer victims for comparing them to Africans. That's from the top female official in the ruling Likud party, and the top male official in the ruling Likud party, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And he says this summer, Israel is preparing to stop the spread of Ebola, to protect from infiltrators. When you hear infiltrators, you need to understand, again, I'll parse that for you. That's a code word in the Israeli lexicon. Infiltrators is the word they use for African refugees in order to vilify them in the minds of Jewish Israelis. So, comparing them to cancer, comparing them to Ebola, death-causing diseases, that's what Africans are to you? Cancer? Ebola? Well, let's just say that it was already on fertile ground that they were working with, because this summer, an Israeli news site decided to conduct a survey. It's President Obama's birthday. What do you think we should give him for his birthday? And wouldn't you know it, 48% of respondents said an envelope with Ebola. So, let's be honest though. This has been going on for a long time. It's a classic white supremacist tactic to compare black people with death, to create that connection in people's minds. So just the other week we remember the passing of Malcolm X. It's been exactly 50 years since he was assassinated. And he taught us how the word Negro, said to mean black, comes from the word necro, which means death. So this idea of associating black people and death-causing diseases is a long-term white supremacist tactic. And Netanyahu and the Likud party are just the most recent people to use this tactic. You walk around Tel Aviv, you see posters, white city, advertising new luxury condo developments in the city. Tel Aviv, luxury living, white city. Now, admittedly, it's also a reference to the Bauhaus architecture that Tel Aviv is popular for. It's even recognized by the United Nations as being a heritage, having this architectural heritage of Bauhaus architecture, which commonly features white. But you can't remove it from its context. The context is that Tel Aviv is a city where African people are being ethnically cleansed. You walk through the streets of Tel Aviv, you see graffiti, shchorim, masrichim, habaita, stinky blacks go home. You see graffiti, medina levanim bilvad, this country is for whites only. Tel Aviv, liberal Tel Aviv, the city where Jewish Israelis firebomb African people's homes, where they firebomb an African kindergarten. And the people who did this didn't serve in jail for one day. Tel Aviv The city where an African mother is holding her baby girl in her arms, a 1-year-old baby. And an Israeli man walks up to them and stabs the baby in the head 3 times. And when the police catch up to this man and they interrogate him and they ask him why he did it, he says, "I tried to kill her because I hate them. They're black. A black baby, blacks in general, are terrorists." Obviously, not every Israeli is going to go out and hack and slash black people. But why did he choose to attack a black baby? Because the government has been inciting racism against them from minute one, of the most vicious kind. Why do you not know about this? Why am I telling you about this now for the first time? Where is the media? Where is the mainstream media? And where are the civil rights groups, or the supposed civil rights groups? The hate groups that masquerade as anti-hate groups, like the Anti-Defamation League. So last year, the Anti-Defamation League sent out emissaries to like 100 countries around the world to conduct this study of anti-Semitism and racism. What countries have attitudes towards racism? Where are they more racist? Where are they less racist? And they spent this massive amount of resources to catalog anti-Semitism all over the world. And yet, they couldn't find it important enough to send a few people to Israel to find out, is there any racism in Israel? Should we study it? Should we do something about it? Well, Tzvi Bar-El of Haaretz wrote about that racism report, that a survey of racism in Israel, the results would make global anti-Semitism pale in comparison. Well, they didn't do the job. I decided to find out for myself what the numbers were. And so I crunched the numbers. I took the ADL's figures, I compared them to the Israeli numbers on the ground, and I found out that proportionally there are 20 times the level of anti-Palestinian hate attacks in Israel compared to anti-Semitic attacks in the US. 20 times the level of hate. And that's only towards Palestinians. That's not counting hate attacks towards Africans and other non-Jews.